Hey gang, Voltie here, back with another deck tech. Today we're going to be doing Merfolk. This was actually a deck that was commissioned by Kixian on Discord. He wanted to see if I could make Merfolk work, considering that Goblins was the go-to typal deck in Highlander, and we wanted to know whether or not it was possible. After doing some deck building and tinkering, I have good news from Kixian saying that the deck is doing reasonably well, which is really exciting. So let's get right into it. To start things off, we have our 1-drop slots. We have 5 1-drops. So we have Benthic Biomancer, which is blue for a 1/1, 2 mana adapt 1, and then when it gets counters, you loot. This card by itself is fine, but the main purpose that it exists here is that it's a 1-mana Merfolk, and you really do want a critical mass of that effect in order to make your Lords work. Next up, we have Cozy's Trickster. Blue for a 1/1, whenever your opponent shuffles their library, it gets a counter. It's very, very surprisingly big. It's super easy for this to attack for 2 and then 3 and then 4, given the nature that every mana base starts with 7 to 9 fetches in Highlander. This does also have other applications as well. If they search the library with Lorien revealed, or with Troll of Khazad-dûm, it also gets a counter, but otherwise it's basically just a 1-mana Merfolk. Next up we have Curse Catcher. This is the classic. Blue for a 1/1, sacrifice Curse Catcher, counter target instant or sorcery unless they pay 1. The main thing that you need to remember with Curse Catcher is that it doesn't counter non-creature spells, it counters instants and sorceries. I see too often that people will try to counter a Planeswalker or an enchantment or an artifact. This only snags instants and sorceries, but otherwise it's a really good way to protect one of your more important creatures. We then have Rishadan Dockhand. Blue for a 1/2 with Island Walk, and then the Rishadan Port text of 1 mana tap target land. Card's pretty good. Island Walk is a very real amount of text. Not all of the Lords give Island Walk, although notably some of them do. The fact that it's a 1/2 is also real upside as well. Once you have Lord effects and it becomes a 2/3, it becomes actually reasonably difficult to rumble with. And so Rishadan Dockhand makes the cut. Last 1-drop we have is Tideshaper. Blue for a 1/1 with Kicker for 1. So if you spend 2 mana, target land becomes an island, and then it gets +1/+1 as long as an opponent controls an island. In a lot of matchups that have blue opponents, you won't need to spend the Kicker. You can simply spend blue, and you can get a 2/2, and you can start rumbling in. However, it is worth noting that if you do spend the Kicker, you can turn a land off for as long as Tideshaper remains on the battlefield. So if your opponent has played a Tolarian Academy and it becomes an island, it's no longer a Tolarian Academy. This is really important, but otherwise it's a 1-mana Merfolk. For 2-drops, we have a new addition from Duskmourn, Floodpit's Drowner. For 2 mana, we get a 2/1 with Flash and Vigilance. When it comes into play, you tap a creature they control and get put a stun counter on it. And then for 2 mana, you can shuffle the Drowner and the creature, or any creature they have with a stun counter on it, into their library. Realistically, this is going to be a 2 mana 2/1 with Flash and Vigilance that helps you in some combats. It's going to be quite rare that you actually use the shuffle mode because it's essentially a 4 mana removal spell with a bit of damage attached to it, but it's something to keep in mind that it does have that additional text. We then have Harbinger of the Tides. You can spend 4 mana to give it Flash, but otherwise it's a 2 mana 2/2, and when it ETBs, you can bounce a tapped creature an opponent controls to their hand. So if you play this with Flash or with Aether Vial, you can bounce an attacking creature, but otherwise you're just bouncing something they've attacked you with, like a Gurmag Angler for example, and on top of all of that, you get a Grizzly Bear. We then have our first 2 Lords. So we have Lord of Atlantis. All Merfolk can play gain Island Walk and +1/+1, and Master of the Pearl Trident, which is other Merfolks that you control, get +1/+1 and have Island Walk. There is a real difference in that if you somehow play against another Merfolk's player, Lord of Atlantis will grow their creatures. Master of the Pearl Trident is strictly better, and that is very sad to say, but otherwise, these are your bread and butter lords. They're the easy ways for you to push through damage and make sure that your creatures are rumbling in and outsizing your opponent's creatures, or you're using their Island Walk and just getting a bunch of damage. Next up we have Merfolk Trickster, blue for a 2/2 with flash, and when it ETBs, tap a creature an opponent controls, and it loses all abilities. There are a couple of different ways you can use this. You can use this to stop something that's going to attack you. However, depending on the creature, you might also use it after it attacks you to ambush it with the Merfolk Trickster. So if, for example, your opponent has a 4/5 Tarmogoyf in play and you have no creatures, if you tap the Tarmogoyf, it'll be an 0/1 and it won't attack. If you let it attack you, you can then tap it, which won't do anything because it's already tapped and attacking, but it'll become an 0/1 and then you can eat it with the Trickster. There are a bunch of other creatures that you can do things with in terms of hitting them with Trickster. Big life-linking idiots is probably one of the bigger ones, but otherwise using it to get through a bunch of damage is your pretty classic go-to case. We have Silvergill Adept. It's one of the bigger reasons to be in Merfolk. For 1 and a blue, we have a 2/1 with enters the battlefield, draw a card, which would be very, very good, but it does have an additional cost. You can either reveal a Merfolk or pay 3 extra mana. The odds that you're spending 5 mana on Silvergill Adept is low, but not 0. Most of the time you're simply going to play it, reveal the next Merfolk you plan on playing, and get a 2/1 that draws a card that'll get bigger. We have Thieving Skydiver. For 2 mana we have a 2/1 with a kicker. X can't be 0. It has flying innately, and when it comes into play, if it was kicked, you can gain control of an artifact with mana value X or less. If it's an equipment, you can attach it to Thieving Skydiver. This text is definitely not nothing. There are a lot of artifacts that people will incidentally have in play that you can take, but otherwise its baseline rate of a 2 mana 2/1 Merfolk with flying is actually really, really good. It's one of the better rates that you'll get out of a 2 mana Merfolk. We then have Vidalian Hexcatcher. This is another lord, and it's the last of our 2 mana lords. 2 mana, 1/1, flash. Other Merfolk you get +1/+1. Does not give Island Walk. And sacrifice a Merfolk, counter target non-creature spell unless they pay 1. The fact that this card hits non-creature spells, where Curse Catcher hits instants and sorceries, irks me a lot, because that templating already existed. But in this case, you can counter Planeswalkers, you can counter enchantments. It's just a very solid card that will always have some amount of text. The fact that it's a Flash Lord is not to be understated. It'll help you win combats out of nowhere, and so it's really potent there. We then have Emperor Mihail II. For 1 blue, we have a 3/3. You may look at the top card, which is irrelevant, because the main part is that you can cast Merfolk spells from the top of your deck. So it's basically a draw engine. It's like an Augur of Autumn or Realm Walker, for example. But notably, when you cast a Merfolk spell, you can also pay an extra 1, so a kicker, and you get a 1/1 blue Merfolk. This card is really good. It doesn't ask much of you. If you untap with it, you can probably draw 1 to 2 cards. But otherwise, if you wait until you can play it and then play another Merfolk on the same turn and guarantee a 1/1, it's also very reasonable. Next up, we have Harbinger of the Seas. This is one of the main reasons that I thought Merfolk was actually viable, is having access to this effect. For 1 blue, we get a 2/2 Merfolk with non-basic lands island. So it's Blood Moon, but it's blue. Harbinger of the Seas sees a lot of play outside of being a Merfolk as just a Magus of the Moon, but different. In this particular deck, making those lands into islands helps with your Island Walk, and having Harbinger be able to be larger than normal is going to protect it from removal spells. So if you have 2 lords, it dodges Bolt. If you have 1 lord, it dodges a Shock. And so I fully expect that this to be one of the reasons that this deck might be viable. We then have Hull Breacher. For 2 and a blue, we get a 3/2 with flash. Whenever they draw an extra card, they don't draw an extra card and you get a treasure token. Card's really good. fact that it has a Merfolk tag is incredible for this deck, but otherwise it's just a solid playable card, so I wasn't too upset with having to put this in. Next up we have Kapala, Warden of Waves. For 1 blue, we get a 2/2. Spells your opponents cast that target a Merfolk cost 2 more, and abilities they activate that target a Merfolk cost 2 more. If you've played Legacy Merfolk in the past, it used to play Kira Glass Spinner. This card is kind of like that, but unlike Kira, this is actually a Merfolk, which helps you kill your opponent. I'm not certain if this would exist in the most fine-tuned version of Merfolk, but for the second or third draft, I thought it was a very reasonable card to be playing. Mero Regery. This is a classic. 2 and a blue for a 2/2. Other Merfolks you control get +1/+1, not Island Walk. And whenever you cast a Merfolk spell, you may tap or untap target permanent. This is really relevant. If you cast a Merfolk for 2 mana, you can untap a land, and suddenly it costs 1 mana. You can also use it to tap your opponent's blockers to kill them. You can play Merfolk post-combat to untap your creatures so you can block. Regery is really good. That's kind of the end of. Sviloon of Sea and Sky is next. 3 mana for a 3/4. It has indestructible as long as you control at least 2 other Merfolk. Whenever it attacks, you draw a card, and other Merfolk you control avoid 1. This card doesn't make your Merfolk bigger. It doesn't give them Island Walk. However, it's just kind of a pile of stats. If you have enough Merfolk, this is indestructible. If you get to attack with it, you get to draw a card. Your opponent is taxed on using their removal spells, and in that sense, if you have other Merfolk, they probably can't point any spells at Sviloon, and suddenly, the whole remove your creatures game plan is falling apart. We then have Tishana's Tidebinder. For 3 mana, you get a 3/2 with Flash, ETB Stifle. Realistically, there is upside in that if it's an artifact creature or planeswalker, that permanent loses all abilities for as long as Tidebind is in play. I would say 90% of the time, it's going to be a 3 mana 3/2 Flash with Stifle. And that's fine, that's good enough. Every now and then you'll fall into one of those edge cases, in which case you'll be grateful, but otherwise it's just kind of a guy. Then we have True Name. This is our first pointed card. 3 mana for a 3/1. You know what True Name does. In this deck, True Name's Merfolk tag is very real, because suddenly True Name is a 5/3 or a 6/4, and then your opponent is dying way quicker than they should be. It's possible that they can have like 2 5/5s and be rumbling in because True Name can't block, and once you start adding in these Lord effects, that becomes no longer a possibility, and it's just a very consistent, safe pick to be playing on 3. Lastly, we have Subtlety. This is a spell, not a Merfolk, but it's pretty required, I would say, in the current metagame. I'm not going to go too much into the rest of the spells because they're all pretty Highlander stapley, but I wanted to talk about the creature suite because obviously a lot of these cards are going to be unfamiliar to a fair amount of Highlander players. For sorceries, we have Ponder, Preordain, and Lorien Revealed. Nothing too crazy here. For spells, we have some interaction. So we have Daze, Counterspell, Misstep, Spell Pierce, Spell Snare, Dismember, and then Flare of Denial, Force of Negation, and Force of Will. These are your classic interactive suite. You can play other counterspells as well if you'd like Logic Knot, for example, but otherwise I think this should be relatively sufficient. This, to my knowledge, would be one of the better Flare of Denial decks. So hopefully this might be able to get that card seeing a little bit more play. And then to round our instance off, we have Brainstorm and Gush. For artifacts, we have a Sapphire. So when this deck was commissioned, one of the big things was I kind of want to see if Sapphire is playable. Maybe Merfolk is the way to go. I think this might actually make the deck good. Playing a 2-drop on turn 1 is really powerful. Moxen are really powerful, that's why they're 3 points, and I think this is going to be one of the better use cases for a Moxen because you're in a color that doesn't have natural acceleration. and so you'll actually get more out of your Sapphire. We then have an Aether Vial and a Wintermoon, so players can't untap more than one non-basic land during their untapped steps. So as long as you're hitting a critical mass of islands in play, your opponent is going to be taxed on their mana where you won't. And then to round it off, we have a Back to Basics. This, in conjunction with Wintermoon and Harbinger of the Seas, actually gives you a very reliable game plan of hating out your opponent's mana and using that to leverage your advantage by casting more and more Merfolk and presenting enough pressure to win the game. For lands, nothing too crazy here. We have a Cavern of Souls, which is probably going to name Elf most of the time. Mutavault, which is a Merfolk. Mystic Sanctuary, which will let you buy back your Gush, and you can start making a very small loop there, but otherwise is probably just going to be buying back a counterspell, and then Odawara, and then some fetches that can get Sanctuary and some islands. For a sideboard, because we're in mono blue, there are pretty limited options in what we can play in our sideboard. I think this gives us a nice split of the effects that we actually want, but going over them, we have 2 Blue Blasts and a Chill. These are your anti-red cards. We have Master of Waves, which is ostensibly an anti-red card, but notably you can bring it in any matchup where you expect your opponent to be light on removal, and you can just make too many guys and kill them. For anti-graveyard cards, we have a Vacuum and a Hearse. These are pretty classic. I don't think you need a third option, however, that's mostly because a lot of the graveyard decks would be kind of soft to a bunch of counter magic. We have a Null Rod, and an Energy Flux as our anti-artifacts card, Stone Scalding as an anti-creature card, Vexing Bauble, which will help against some of the combo decks, Thorn of Amethyst as an extra way to help against the combo decks, Jit, which is a pretty classic Merfolk sideboard card for your creature matchups, Brazen Burrow, which almost made the cut in the main deck as just a general all-purpose card, and then a Mystical Dispute for your blue matchups because we can't play Rebs, and a Submerge because it's one of the best sideboard blue cards. So that's it. If you're playing any of the online Fight Night events and you decide that maybe you want to try Fish, by all means you can check this deck out. I'll put the link down below, but otherwise I'm hoping that maybe we can get Fish back on the map. I'm not certain that you'll need a Mox Sapphire to play it, but for this instance, thank you very much Kixian for the deck's idea, and for the deck commission. This video was brought to you with the help and support of my lovely patrons and donors who you can see up here on screen. If you'd like to help support the channel, there'll be links down below to the Patreon and the Ko-Fi. But otherwise, if you're watching this on YouTube, please consider liking and subscribing. I know that you probably hear that a lot, but it really does help out the channel a ton. And, I would like to think that people are watching the content and want to see more of it, and this will be a nice, cute way to remind me. But otherwise, that's it from me. Catch you all next time.